You're listening to Bold Dominion, a state news explainer podcast for a changing Virginia. I'm Mary Garner McGee, and I have not done my taxes yet this year. I will soon, though. And most years, after trudging through my federal return, my Virginia state taxes are kind of an afterthought. But, as a lot of us have probably heard, our state taxes really do impact our daily lives in pretty direct ways, like healthcare and K-12 education. So, on this episode, we're going to do a deep dive into Virginia state taxes. What are the types of taxes we pay, where does that money go, and how did we wind up with the system that we have? I'm joined today by two of my WTJU colleagues. Sage Tangway is back on the show.
Hello.
And Ben Larson, another producer here at WTJU.
Hi.
All right, how are y'all feeling? Have you done your taxes yet this year?
No,
not yet.
Spoiler alert, that's because we're actually going to do a two-part series, and in 2 weeks, we're going to all sit down and do our state taxes together. So this is, your policy primer, and then we'll get into some of the nitty-gritty details. Okay, so there are three main types of taxes. So the first kind of tax is tax on what you earn. That's income tax. You're getting those W-2s and 1099s. That's all having to do with income taxes. The second kind is taxes on what you buy, and that's sales tax. And we're all paying that all the time, every time we buy something. And then the third kind of taxes are taxes on things you own. So that's property taxes, personal property taxes, estate taxes, inheritance taxes. Some other countries have wealth taxes, so that's taxes on money that you own. But the U.S. doesn't have any of those.
this is helpful because right now I know I need to pay my car tax to the county because I have that sitting on my kitchen counter.
We are going to talk so much about the car tax. I'm so glad you brought that up. So the car tax is a kind of personal property tax. Often at the beginning of the show, we like to talk about the levels of government and how they all work together on a topic. So the federal government mainly collects income taxes and then also tariffs or like customs, which are taxes on imported goods. And then most states levy both an income tax and a sales tax. And most localities levy property taxes, and many also levy a sales tax. And then the other thing I want to point out, just like at the very beginning, is that businesses also pay taxes. And there's like a lot there. So we're mostly going to focus on individual taxes in this episode.
Yeah, most people, I think, with businesses are already having to dive into some of this on their own or with an accountant. But I think on the individual, you could get through never really knowing anything about your taxes, but doing them every year.
Yeah, and I should also say, this is not tax advice. That'll probably be fairly obvious. I will, one piece of tax advice is you should do your taxes. That's the end of the advice.
So what about Virginia specifically?
Yeah, so we all pay federal income tax. And we also pay Medicare and Social Security taxes. So those are payroll taxes. They're income-based, but they have like a dedicated fund that you're paying into. Whereas like our federal income tax goes into like the general fund for the federal government. And then we pay Virginia income taxes, which is just general fund for the Virginia state budget. And then we also pay Virginia sales taxes. And then in Virginia, property tax, so tax on real estate and tangible personal property, is administered by localities. And so the tax rates for real estate and tangible personal property are going to be different in every locality. I will say the main tangible personal property tax that most of us as individuals pay is on vehicles. So it covers some other things like aircraft and boats.
Oh, yes, my many flying machines.
I know, I wish, maybe one day. And then businesses also pay tangible personal property tax on their expensive machinery and stuff like that. But again, we're focusing mostly on individuals. So most of us, when we pay personal property tax, are paying car tax and then maybe real estate tax if you own land or you own a house or something like that.
So as somebody who doesn't really own any property, I'm more interested in the income tax. Can we go into that a little more?
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to start by talking about the difference between flat taxes versus progressive taxes. So a flat tax means that someone making $10,000 a year and someone making $100,000 a year both pay 5%. So that means they're going to pay very different amounts in taxes, but as a percentage of their total income, they're paying the same thing. Progressive taxes are a means of redistribution. So that means that higher earners are not only paying more in like real dollars, they're also paying a higher percentage of their income. And federal income tax has a pretty big range in what the rates over different tax brackets are. So the lowest rate is 10% and the highest rate is 37%. So the highest earners pay 37% on some of their income. And so this is where tax brackets come in. And tax brackets are pretty commonly misunderstood. So I want to talk about those for a minute. So let's say we have a fictional tax bracket system. So for every $10,000 you earn, your tax rate goes up by 2% in this fake bracket system. So you might think that if you go from earning $10,000 to $10,500, that your tax rate goes from 2% to 4%, that you kind of jump off a cliff when you cross that $10,000 mark. But that's not how it works at all. Actually, if your annual income goes from $10,000 to $10,500, your tax rate goes from 2% to only 2.1%. So how did I get that number? So on the first $10,000, you pay 2% tax, and that's $200. And then I paid 4% tax on the $500 above $10,000, and that's $20. So my total tax in this system was $220, and my income was $10,500, so my tax rate is 2.1%.
Okay, so a state can either have progressive or flat income tax, but how do they determine which one they want?
Yeah, so that gets at a very deep, fundamental, different interpretations of fairness and equity. So, there's an interpretation of fairness that takes into consideration like structural inequality and the notion that poverty can be intergenerational. So there's a notion of fairness that takes people's ability to pay into consideration. And then there's an interpretation of fairness that says, everyone should be treated the same regardless of their disadvantage or their privilege. So, states look at their budgets and they look at their population and stuff. But this question of are we going to charge flat taxes or are we going to charge progressive taxes is one of these questions that really gets at the root of what is our political culture and what do we value as a society. I'll also say, we're seeing record inequality in America right now. The middle class is shrinking, and progressive taxes are a way to limit inequality. And, kind of the rationale behind that is that a deeply unequal society is bad for everyone and limits opportunity for everyone.
And it's not an insignificant number of states that have this flat tax rate either.
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty common.
And even a few with no wage income tax either, too.
Yep. Yeah, there are a number of states that have no income tax.
Wow. Okay. I did not know that. So which one does Virginia have? Do we have flat or progressive taxes?
Great question. So Virginia technically has progressive taxes. We have 4 tax brackets. But the top tax bracket is $17,000. So we just described the bracket system, right? So the 4 brackets in Virginia are you pay 2% on your first $3,000 of income. You pay 3% on $3,001 to $5,000 of income. you pay 5% on $5,001 to $17,000, and then all the income you make over $17,000, you pay 5.75% income tax on. So it's not exactly a flat tax, but if you're working full-time at the Virginia minimum wage, you're making about $26,000 a year. So it's not exactly a flat tax because that person working full-time at minimum wage is paying around 3% total. And a person making $1 million in Virginia is paying like 5.7% total. But it's not very progressive at all because, some of our lowest income full-time workers are topping out at the top tax bracket, which is not usually how progressive taxes are designed.
Yeah, just for reference, that's just a few $1,000s higher than the federal poverty guideline for 2025 too.
Also, isn't there like a lowest income that you like have to file taxes for? Like there's a minimum requirement. Isn't it like $10,000 or something like that?
So the minimum amount that you have to earn in Virginia to be required to pay taxes on it is an adjusted gross income of about $12,000, like just under $12,000. So, that's people who are working part-time, either at high rates or at minimum wage, a lot of students. So even if you're working part-time, you still have to pay state taxes if you're making $12,000.
So of the 4 tax brackets that exist in Virginia, 2 of them, if you're in them, you don't even have to file taxes.
Correct. But again, so like let's say $3,000 is a quarter of your income, right? That means a much higher proportion of your income, you're paying taxes at 2% versus 5.75%. So if you think back to that example I just gave, where a person working full-time at minimum wage, their total tax rate is only 3%, that's because they're only paying 5.75 on $17,000 to $26,000. So that's a smaller proportion of their total income. Whereas a person earning $1 million, $17,000 is like a minuscule proportion of their income. So they're basically paying that 5.75% on all of their income.
Yeah.
So that's why, I'm not going to come out here and say like we have a flat tax because there's a lot of people like the difference between 3% and 5.7% is not like nothing. But especially if you compare it to like how progressive federal taxes are, it's not a huge difference.
It seems like the progressive system in Virginia doesn't do anything about like middle income to high income.
Yep.
So how do we end up here with a pretty flat progressive tax?
So, one important element is that the tax brackets haven't changed since 1990. And in 1990, it wasn't like a crazy progressive tax system, but the median income in Virginia was half what it is now in 1990. So there were a lot more people that were paying only up to that second or third tax bracket. And one way to think about this is that when median income goes up, but the tax brackets don't change, what you get is a tax increase on the lowest income Virginians. Because it used to be that there were more people whose top tax rate was 3% or 5%. And now there are many, many fewer people whose top tax rate is 3% or 5%.
Just so I have it in my mind, what are those median incomes that we're talking about?
Yeah, so in 1990, the median household income, so not individual, household income, was $35,000. And in 2023, the median household income was $90,000.
Oh, wow.
So it's actually almost tripled. I think if you look at the individual ones, it's like more in the doubling range. But I mean, that's a lot of change to not have any change to our tax brackets.
Yeah, that's pretty crazy. I wasn't expecting a 3 times increase.
Yeah, and again, not exactly 3 times, but yeah, close to 3 times. It's a big change.
So what does the future look like for our tax system here?
Yeah. There is a great JLARC, if you know, you know. No, I'm just kidding. I'll tell you what that is. There's a great Joint Legislative Audit Review Commission, that's JLARC, report that they did this fall in 2024 that looked at changing our tax brackets. I will link it in the show notes. It is so fascinating. It's very cool to check out. So basically, in last year's General Assembly session, they passed a bill asking JLARC to look into our tax brackets. And so JLARC came up with 11 options that they evaluated according to how progressive they were, how they would change state revenue, and whose tax rates would change the most, who would be most effective. So basically, the General Assembly was like, give us some options for changing our tax brackets. And they came up with these 11 options. The options that would increase state revenue the most were options that would create a new bracket at the very top of the income distribution. So people making $600,000 or more per year, which is the top 1% of income earners in Virginia, or a new tax bracket only for people earning $1 million, which is even less than 1%. So those are the ones that would most increase state revenue, and they would affect 1% or less than 1% of Virginians. There were a bunch of other options they considered that would, change the brackets in other ways, but many of those would actually reduce state revenue. So we'll see if the General Assembly decides to take up this issue. It seems like it would be very unpopular with Youngkin. Governor Youngkin responded to this JLARC report saying that Virginia needed to keep income taxes low to attract new businesses. And he's made keeping taxes low and cutting taxes like a big part of especially his agenda for his last year in office this year. So yeah, we'll see if maybe in the next gubernatorial administration, if that's something that the General Assembly looks at more seriously. Virginia takes in about $20 billion in income tax revenue, and that's about 2/3 of their total revenue. So making changes to these tax brackets, could affect the biggest source of revenue for state government.
And it sounds like it wouldn't change the tax rate for most of Virginians.
Yeah, again, they looked at 11 options. So
right.
I highly recommend people to check out this report because some of the options would affect, there'd be less burden on low income or less burden on middle income or more burden on middle income. But the thing that really stood out to me is if the goal is to raise more state revenue, the report said the options that most raise state revenue were these options that only affect 1%, Virginia's highest income earners.
And to keep in mind, too, about that top rate at whether it's $600,000 or $1 million, they still get to keep the $1 million beneath that at one rate. It's just anything above those rates gets additional tax.
Yes, exactly.
Excellent. I will be excited to look at this report.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think maybe the tax that we experience most obviously on a day-to-day basis is sales tax. What is Virginia's sales tax?
Yeah, so in most places it's 5.3%, and it's on things that you buy. We're all used to paying sales tax on most of the things that we buy. It brings in about $5 billion, which is about 16% of total revenue. And then there are some places where sales tax is as high as 7%, but typically it's 5.3%.
It's so interesting, too, just because I'll notice it when I go out, and I mean I've lived in Virginia my whole life basically, and but part of it's prices are inflated anyway, so we're paying more for a cup of coffee or something like that. But you go to the cafe, you get a cup of coffee, something to eat, and then you're like, okay, well, I know these prices. Okay, it's going to be $15. And then the tax gets put on and then the tip, and you're like, oh my God, this was a significant outing. I'm actually spending quite a bit of money.
So it's interesting that you bring up cafes because in addition to state sales tax, there's also meals tax.
Oh.
And meals tax is a local tax. So even from Charlottesville, where we are, to Albemarle, which is a mile away, the meals tax is a little bit different. So not all parts of Virginia have meals tax, but it is pretty common. And Virginia does charge state sales tax, 5.3%, on meals, alcoholic beverages, that kind of thing that you'd buy at a restaurant. But then localities can charge an additional meals tax on top of that. So here in Charlottesville, it's 7%. In Albemarle, it's 6%. In Richmond, it's 7.5%. So it's common in Virginia for the tax on a meal to be between 10 and 13%. So yeah, when you go to a restaurant and you see that number on the menu, you got to mentally add like 30% to it.
Yeah.
It's going to actually cost you a third more than the menu listed price once you add tip in. So like around 10% towards Virginia sales tax and meals tax, and then another, like 15-20% for tip.
Yeah, this actually reminds me a lot of lodging taxes on like hotels and resorts.
Which is also a local tax.
Yeah.
And a lot of parts of Virginia also have a lodging tax, again, on top of sales tax.
Wow. So you mentioned that the sales tax rate is higher in some places than others. Why is that? Why does it differ at all?
Yeah, the highest rate, 7%, is in and around Williamsburg. And that's because in 2018, that region lobbied the General Assembly for permission to charge extra sales tax in just 3 counties in what they call Virginia's, quote, historic triangle. And the General Assembly gave them permission to charge a little bit of additional sales tax on top of that, 1.7%, bringing it to 7% in the 3 counties around Williamsburg. And those funds go towards marketing the region to potential tourists and then also just into those counties like general funds. And then there are a few other counties that also have a higher sales tax. And again, they had to ask the General Assembly for permission, and the General Assembly gave them permission to raise their sales tax. And those are in very different places and for very different reasons. So outside of that historical triangle, the counties that have a higher sales tax are parts of the state that do not bring in a lot of money in property taxes. And so these sales taxes are a way for them to fund largely capital projects in their school systems.
So what are some exceptions to this tax rule? I know it can vary from locality to locality, but are there some consistencies across the state?
Yeah, so most things that you buy are going to be subject to Virginia sales tax. There's only a few things that are not subject to that 5.3% tax. So the biggest exception that you'll probably notice is that food for home consumption and essential hygiene products are taxed at a lower sales tax rate of 1%. So if you've ever gone to the grocery store and bought like $100 of groceries, but you've only paid like $1 in tax, that's why. It's because food, like produce, canned goods, bread, stuff like that you're going to use to like cook at home is only taxed at 1%. And then hygiene products, the big one here is like menstrual products. This was a change in like the last decade. They used to be taxed at the regular 5.3%, and they reduced that to that grocery amount of 1%. And then, it must get so complicated for grocery stores because, like, for example, if you're selling prepared food at a grocery store, like you go to the Wegmans here in Charlottesville and you buy something from the Hot Bar, that's taxed at 5.3%. Alcohol is not subject to the sales tax exemption. So different goods, even within like a grocery store, are taxed at different rates. And then also, there's like rules around peer-to-peer selling and online marketplaces and stuff like that that can sometimes like some of those things are subject to sales tax depending on like how frequently you sell and are you selling across state lines and that kind of thing. But the basic is that, you're going to pay 5.3% unless you're buying groceries or essential hygiene products. And then there are some interesting sales tax exemptions that I would have never thought of. So one is gun safes are exempt from the regular 5.3 sales tax, but not if they're glass fronted. So basically, the General Assembly wants to incentivize people to store their guns in a safe manner, but they don't want you to display them.
Not a big fancy one.
Yeah.
Just a metal locker that you stick your guns in.
This one makes a ton of sense. Prescription drugs. Prescription drugs are not subject to 5.3% sales tax. And then there's a really interesting exception for art made by people incarcerated at Virginia state prisons. So if people are making art while they're incarcerated, they can sell it and they don't have to charge sales tax on that.
Those are all unusual and things that I
And that's like half of them.
Maybe I could have predicted prescription drugs, but the other two I would not have dreamed up on my own. Well, is there any time of the year where these taxes are not in place? Like, is there any chance? Right, there are states that like don't have sales tax at all. Like New Hampshire comes to mind. Is there any time in Virginia where you don't have to pay sales taxes?
Yes. So once a year, Virginia has a state sales tax holiday. And this started in 2006. I remember the first year that they passed this. Do y'all remember that?
I don't.
So it's the first weekend in August, and, mainly the point is just to give Virginians a little bit of a break when they have to spend money on school supplies and, like, new clothes and shoes and stuff like that for their kids. So it's not a sales tax holiday on all goods. If I were to go to, Walmart and buy, like, furniture and windshield wiper blades that weekend, I'm still going to pay sales tax on that. It's mostly for clothing and school supplies. Now, there are two other categories of goods that you can buy on that sales tax holiday weekend, and they are gas-powered chainsaws and chainsaw accessories and qualified Energy Star or WaterSense products. Do y'all want to guess why those items are included in our sales tax holiday?
I feel like we're going in two different directions with gas-powered chainsaws and then the qualifying Energy Star.
They are different reasons.
Yeah,
they're
okay,
different things we're trying to incentivize. So there's three things we're trying to incentivize or like make it a little bit easier for people to buy over the sales tax holiday. School supplies and clothes for kids. Why the chainsaws?
Getting ready for winter.
It's hurricane preparedness. So it's actually all hurricane preparedness products are also exempted from sales tax on this weekend. But they specifically single out chainsaws, which it's so funny. Like, you think about going to like Walmart or whatever and you're buying like kids' shoes and notebooks and then also picking up like a gas-powered chainsaw.
I love that it's actually part of a general thing about hurricanes, and I wonder like how deep does that category go? Like, because there's a lot of things that could go under hurricane preparedness.
Well, if you want to read the full list, you can go to tax.virginia.gov, and they have a whole section on retail sales and use tax, and you can read like the whole list of all year sales tax exemptions, and then also all of the hurricane preparedness items that you can buy with no sales tax the first weekend of August. And then the Energy Star ones, I mean, it kind of makes sense. They're trying to incentivize people to buy more energy efficient appliances, and so they just made it part of this existing tax holiday. And like I said, it started in 2006, and the General Assembly has recently extended it through 2030. And then in 2030, I mean, it's a pretty popular thing. People like it. In 2030, they'll just reevaluate the amounts because there's caps on how much these items can be exempted. So, like, each individual school supply can't cost more than $20 to qualify for the tax. So they'll look at inflation and how much stuff costs and reevaluate those.
Okay, well, I know there's also special taxes like the plastic bag tax at grocery stores, right?
Yes, and people who live in other parts of the state might be like, I'm sorry, what are they talking about? So in a few parts of the state, Charlottesville, Albemarle, almost all of Northern Virginia, Roanoke, a few other cities, if you go to a store and you want a plastic bag, you have to pay 5 cents per bag. And it's just a way of disincentivizing people from using single-use plastics and to bring their own grocery bags. And yes, that is technically a sales tax.
Yeah, when this happened, it was like a switch was flicked in my brain because I just thought everybody was doing it, and it wasn't until I got out of Virginia. Nobody was paying for their plastic bags. I was amazed.
Okay, so this is such a nerdy thing, but if you're someone who cares about reducing, your impact on the climate and you want to use reusable bags, I'm just going to put a plug in for Canvas. You buy some cheap, 100% cotton, sturdy canvas bags, and you can wash them, and they will last you forever. Now, in my case, you'll have these, and then you'll leave them in your car every time, and then you'll end up trying to carry all of the things out of the store in your arms, and then you'll drop a couple, and then, the teenagers that work there will, stare at you and be like, why didn't you just pay the 5 cents for a bag? But, yeah, in general, it's an interesting new little tax in some parts of Virginia. Woo! Okay.
Wow, we dipped into a lot of places with that one.
So that's sales tax, y'all.
So we're kind of back to something we mentioned at the very beginning, which is property taxes, and more specifically, the car taxes. Could you tell us a little bit about how those work?
Yes. Like we said at the beginning, Virginia property taxes are local taxes. So they're administered by the city or county that you live in, and the revenue goes to the city or county that you live in. And the two main types that most individuals pay are real estate tax, so that's property taxes on your house or land that you own, or personal property tax, which is typically cars, so hence the term the car tax. But both of these rates, the real estate rate and the personal property rate, are going to vary a ton from locality to locality. Every county and city sets their own personal property and their own real estate tax. But every locality in Virginia charges some amount of personal property tax and some amount of real estate tax. So let's say you own a house that's worth $400,000. In the parts of the state with the lowest real estate taxes, you're going to pay about $1,500 a year on that. And in parts of the state with higher real estate taxes, you're going to pay almost $6,000 on that $400,000 house. And then same thing with car taxes. They're different from locality to locality, and they are also assessed on $100 of value. The lowest car tax by a lot is 1/10 of a cent per $100, and that is in Bath County. Sage,
Yeah,
your hometown.
my hometown. I've actually paid this tax. I've had cars registered in Bath County, and I was always shocked, when I moved here, and my car tax, it's still not, I mean, I have a crappy car, so it's not that big of a tax, but it is significantly more. I remember in Bath County, it was kind of a $10 or $15 tax that you pay twice a year.
Per year.
Yeah, or per year.
Oh my God.
And so it's kind of you show up at the courthouse and give them your $5 bill and leave. And
I just love to think of it as a tip jar.
yeah, it's literally, I mean, there's quite literally a box outside that you can put envelopes.
Somebody's taken a knife and cut a slit in the top of the peanut butter jar lid.
It very much feels like that. And what's also interesting to me about Bath County is they have the Homestead Resort, which has a pretty big income. It's also a popular location for second homes. There's several different types of property taxes in Bath County that are specific to tourism or lodging that I don't think are necessarily in the surrounding counties. But yeah, very, very, very low personal property tax on cars especially.
So in Bath County, if you have a car that's worth about $10,000, you're going to pay about $40 a year in property tax. In most parts of the state, on that $10,000 car, you're going to pay between $200 and $400 a year in car tax.
Yeah, and honestly, this works out. The culture in Bath County is that every family has like 5 or 6 terribly functioning cars. Everyone has like a couple cars that like maybe will work again someday.
Yeah,
So-
my family has that too, but we're paying those car taxes,
I know,
man.
jeez,
It's expensive
can't
to have a
believe
fleet
it.
of beaters in this part of the state.
Exactly. So I kind of wonder if that is part of why it's still so low. Okay, so it sounds like this car tax is a little bit under fire right now in the state of Virginia.
Yeah, so Governor Youngkin has made getting rid of the car tax a big goal for his last year in office. He's called it, like the most hated tax in Virginia and stuff. But we just talked about how the car tax is a local tax. It's not a state tax. So I was really curious about this when we started doing this episode. Like, how would he get rid of a tax, again, that's not a state tax? So the state could bar localities from collecting car tax, personal property tax, but then localities would suddenly lose a bunch of revenue. And that's bad. Like, presumably the localities would be mad about that. So when Youngkin says he's going to get rid of the car tax, here's what he's actually proposing. So Youngkin has proposed that the state set aside state money this year, about $1 billion, in a car tax refund, like pot of money. Then twice a year in 2025, I'll pay my $90 to the city of Charlottesville for my beloved 2011 Toyota Prius. And then next year, in 2026, when I file my 2025 taxes, I'll say I paid $187.10 in car tax. And if I'm under the income cap of $50,000 adjusted gross income, then I get $150 extra in my Virginia tax return. So if his proposal goes into law, then you still pay the car tax, but then the next year you get most of it or some of it back, depending on how much your car is worth, in your tax refund. And it's capped at $50,000 adjusted gross income for an individual filer or $100,000 adjusted gross income for a couple.
So theoretically, the localities would still get their tax.
Yep.
And the money would just be coming from the state government and redistributed back to people who fit that tax distinction.
Exactly. Yeah. So again, I think this, like, we're going to get rid of the car tax is like very confusing because you're still going to pay, like, if this passed, you're still going to pay tax. You're just going to get a little bit more back in your refund. Gotcha. But this looks very unlikely to pass. Governor Youngkin is a Republican. The General Assembly is controlled by Democrats. We're almost done with the General Assembly session this year, and the Democrats have not included this car tax in their budget amendment bills, and instead they're proposing tax rebates between $200 and $400 that would not be tied to the car tax.
So we've talked a lot about all of these different ways that the state pulls tax revenue from the citizenry. What do these taxes pay for?
Okay, this is my favorite part because state taxes actually pay for a bunch of stuff that we use all the time. The number one thing that our state taxes go towards is health and human services. So under this umbrella, we have Medicaid, which is a federal health insurance program for low-income people that functions pretty similarly to Medicare and is jointly funded by the federal government and the state. So one of the things that your state taxes pay for is health insurance for low-income people, which I think is really important, and other funding for like our healthcare and our hospital systems in the state. So, we talked at the beginning about how not all states have income tax, and also not all states are part of this program called Medicaid expansion. So there are many states where the states do not put in sufficient funding into Medicaid to get like bonuses from the federal government. And it just means that there's a lot of especially like children and low-income people that just don't have access to adequate health care. That's something that I think really affects all of us on like a pretty personal level. The number 2 thing that your state taxes go to is K through 12 education. So this includes direct aid to K through 12 public schools. And the public schools in Virginia are jointly funded by localities and the state. So state funding, helps pay teachers and guidance counselors and custodial staff, bus drivers, like all the people that maintain our education system. And, there are some parts of the state that collect a lot of property taxes because they're wealthy areas. And then there are some parts of the state that don't collect a lot of local property taxes. And so those K through 12 education dollars, they go to the whole state, but they also go to like making sure that across the state of Virginia, everyone gets an adequate public education, regardless of whether they live in a super high wealth area or whether they're in like a lower wealth area. And another thing that's been a big push in recent years is expanding early childhood education in Virginia. So this is like pre-K, 3K programs for kids before they come to kindergarten. Across the country, preschool costs, daycare costs, early childhood education costs have been a huge issue. It's very unaffordable, and the people who work in it are being paid very little. Many, many studies have shown that early childhood education before kindergarten is really, really important. So those are the 2 big ones that your state tax dollars go to. Health and Human Services, K through 12 education. Number 3 is higher education, so funding for public universities, but also community colleges. Virginia has a great community college system. We have a lot of really, really good community colleges. We have a shortage of people working in the trades. Our community college system is pretty accessible to a lot of Virginians. It's very high quality, and it's largely funded by your tax dollars, in addition to, tuition and stuff that a lot of students pay. And then the 4th biggest spending category in the Virginia state budget is public safety. So this covers the Virginia State Police and then state money for local police departments. So, I'm not trying to say that your federal taxes don't matter, but when I hear people talking about like wanting to move to places with lower state taxes, I'm like, don't you want to live in a state that has good schools? Like, don't you want to live in a state that has good hospitals? Like, I think state taxes are just this very direct way that we are like contributing to services that most of us are going to use at some point.
Yeah, it sounds like state taxes in Virginia really focus on exactly what affects day-to-day life for the majority of people here.
Yeah. And I will say, our tax system as a whole is sort of designed to be frustrating. And I think it's like good to acknowledge and complain about areas in which doing our taxes is like more complicated than it needs to be. But when you see those state taxes leave your paycheck every month or every 2 weeks, that's what you're paying for.
So after doing all this research, is there anything that you would change about Virginia taxes?
Yes. Okay. So you go to another country, right?
Yeah.
And you go into a restaurant and you want to order a sandwich and it'll say, this sandwich is €9. And then you go up to pay and they only charge you €9 because the sales tax and the meals tax and the gratuity and stuff is included in the price. So I think this is extremely unlikely that this is going to change. It's very much a cultural thing. But I think it's so frustrating that our sales tax is something that's tacked on at the end rather than included in the price that you look at. Especially, if you're going to buy something big like a computer or something, if you get up to the register and it's like tens of dollars, like $50, $100 more than you're expecting, that's just really unpleasant. And I think there's a better way.
Yeah, I don't have much of a reference for how this is across other states, but I do think it's pretty high. I just think back to when I was working at a register at a restaurant, and I literally had a guy look at me and say, "You're kidding me, right?" as I was ringing him up because he was not used to how high the tax rate was for us.
Yeah, there are some great Reddit posts about that from people visiting Virginia. What about y'all? Is there anything you would change or questions that you have?
I think overall with tax filing, I know in other countries, workers receive basically like a bill in the mail of like, here's what you still owe in taxes. Here's what we owe you. Like it's not something that the individual has to file and kind of navigate this like wild system where, you know, our government does know how much we owe them or don't owe them. They already know that information. And there's a lot of like little mistakes that can be made when you're filing your taxes on your own that can make that a little more complicated and kind of expose you to vulnerability legally, to audits and all of that kind of stuff. And while I really enjoy the process of like putting in all of my little numbers and, you know,
honestly can't relate. Happy for you though.
But like, I know that it is a massive stress for a lot of working people to sit down and find the time to like really focus and make sure they're getting that they're taking the right deductions and, you know, signing up for the right credits. And it would be great if people were just like, here's what you haven't paid yet through your typical like paycheck deductions.
And it's just such a symptom of like the way that lobbying has an impact on like some of these things that affect our daily lives, right? I mean, like it's been very well reported that the tax preparation industry, so like Intuit TurboTax and QuickBooks and, you know, these like software companies have really put a lot of pressure on Congress to not make it easier to file your taxes because they make so much money off of us paying for that software. So, yeah.
Well, luckily, we'll all have each other for the next episode to do our taxes together.
Yeah.
Yes. So while I don't enjoy filing my taxes, I actually am like very interested in taxes. I think it's just this like very direct way that we interact with our government. So we're not doing just one episode, we're doing 2 episodes. So we'll be back in 2 weeks. And in that episode, we're going to all sit down and attempt to do our taxes together and talk about it. And we'll also talk about some stuff we didn't get to this week. So what are Virginia tax credits and deductions and how are they different? Are they different? We'll also talk about auditing and we'll probably talk a little bit more too about like how the way that we pay our taxes in Virginia is similar to or different from other states. So come back for more tax season commiseration. Thank you all both so much for coming.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, pleasure to be here.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Bold Dominion. Thank you to Sage and Ben for chatting with me, and thank you to our assistant producer, Sarah Bastinelli, for help with research and editing. You can find more Bold Dominion episodes at bolddominion.org or wherever else you listen to podcasts. Don't forget to subscribe.